The sun cast its golden rays over the sprawling estate of the Omoteo family, one of the wealthiest households in the bustling city of Iko-Royal. Known for its modern skylines intertwined with traditional African architecture, Iko-Royal was a playground for the elite. Here, fortunes were made and legacies forged. At the heart of it all was Ade Omoteo, a self-made billionaire who had left the city 2 decades ago to chase bigger dreams abroad. Ade was known to be generous yet elusive, rarely visiting his family in Nigeria. Word of his vast wealth and international businesses made him a figure of admiration, but also suspicion. He was a ghost at family reunions, a legend whose absence loomed over every conversation. But today was different. Dressed in frayed clothes, his once glossy shoes scuffed, Ade stepped off a cramped bus that had carried him from the airport. His face was gaunt, his usually groomed beard overgrown and patchy. The tattered suitcase in his hand, containing his few remaining possessions, barely hinted at the immense wealth he had left behind. To anyone watching, Ade looked like a broken man. And that was exactly what he wanted. He glanced around, taking in the bustling city streets. Street vendors hollered, hawking roasted corn and akara by the roadside. Yellow minibuses sped by, their conductors yelling destinations into the air. Iko-Royal was still alive, as vibrant as he remembered, but he knew the wealthy enclave where his family resided was a world apart. Ade had made up his mind to test them, his siblings, his cousins, even his mother. For years, he had showered them with money, paid for their children's school fees, and financed their extravagant parties. Yet something inside him had begun to gnaw away. Were they truly loyal to him? Did they love him for who he was, or only for his money? 2 days earlier, Ade had spread rumors through an old friend that he had been deported from the United States after losing everything. The story would spread like wildfire, especially in his circles. Now, he was returning as a supposed failure, hoping to see who would stand by him and who would turn away. Arrival at the Omoteo family compound. The Omoteo estate stood tall, a sprawling mansion painted in cream and gold, surrounded by lush palm trees. The gates alone were a testament to their wealth, ornate black iron adorned with the family crest. Ade hesitated for a moment before pressing the intercom button. A sharp voice answered almost instantly. "Who is this?" "It's Ade," he replied, trying to sound weary. "I've come home." There was a pause. A long one. Then came the click of the gates unlocking. He dragged his suitcase behind him, walking slowly down the cobblestone driveway. His sister, Remy, was the first to appear. Dressed in a flowing Ankara gown, her makeup immaculate, she looked stunned to see him. "Ade, is that you?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yes, it's me," he said, his voice trembling just enough to sell the act. "I've been through a lot." Remy's eyes darted to his worn clothes, his shabby suitcase. She covered her mouth as if to hide her shock. "What happened?" "You look," she stopped herself, clearly unsure how to finish the sentence. Before Ade could respond, their younger brother, Femi, stepped out of the house. Femi was the life of every party, the one who spent the most of Ade's money while claiming to be the family's manager. His reaction was less subtle. "Ah, what's all this? Ade, is this some kind of joke?" Femi asked, eyeing his brother with suspicion. "It's not a joke," Ade replied, his voice heavy with mock exhaustion. "I lost everything. My businesses collapsed. I got deported." Femi's face twisted in confusion and mild irritation. "Deported? How?" Ade shrugged, his eyes fixed on the ground. "It's a long story. I just need to stay here for a while. I don't have anywhere else to go." Remy looked at Femi, her expression unreadable. "Of course, you can stay," she said quickly, though her tone lacked warmth. "Your family." Femi scoffed. "Stay? Remy, do you know what you're saying? We need to think about this. Things aren't as easy as they used to be, you know." Ade raised his head slightly, studying his siblings' reactions. So far, his sister seemed eager to put up a front of concern, while his brother's hesitation betrayed him. "I won't be a burden," Ade said softly. "I just need a roof over my head for a while." The first night. That evening, the family gathered in the dining room. Ade noticed how little effort had been made to include him. The table was set with the usual extravagance, gold-plated cutlery, crystal glasses, but his seat was at the far end, away from the center. He picked at his food silently as Femi laughed loudly with their cousins, cracking jokes about business deals and exotic vacations. Remy occasionally glanced at Aid but said little. Their mother, Mama Omoteo, hadn't even come down to see him yet. Aid wondered how much of this was because of his fall from grace. Was this how they always treated people they considered beneath them? As the evening wore on, he excused himself and retreated to the small guest room they had offered him. It was far from the lavish master suite he used to occupy during his visits. Alone, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his suitcase. He reached inside and pulled out a worn photograph of his late father. The man had taught him everything he knew about life and business. "Let's see how much of what you taught me applies here, Baba," he muttered. Just as he was about to lie down, there was a knock at the door. It was Remy. She stepped inside cautiously, closing the door behind her. "Aid," she began, her voice quiet. "Are you really okay? Is there more to this story?" Aid looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why do you ask?" Remy hesitated. I've never seen you like this. It's hard to believe you've really lost everything." For a moment, Aid considered telling her the truth, but he stopped himself. He needed to see how far this would go. Instead, he said, "I'm tired, Remy. We'll talk tomorrow." She nodded slowly and left the room, but Aid could sense her unease. As the door clicked shut, he sighed. The cracks were beginning to show, and he hadn't even begun to push. The next morning, Aid woke up early. The small guest room he'd been given was cold and sparse, a stark contrast to the luxurious suites he had grown accustomed to in his travels. His back ached from the thin mattress, but he shook it off. Today, he was going to observe them even more closely. Downstairs, the sound of laughter and clinking dishes filled the air. Aid stepped into the expansive dining room and saw the family seated at the table. Breakfast was a feast of akara, moin moin, freshly baked bread, and steaming mugs of tea. Femi glanced up as Aid entered, his smile fading slightly. "Morning," he said curtly, not bothering to get up. Aid mumbled a greeting and took a seat at the far end of the table. The seat closest to his mother, Mama Omoteo, was notably empty, but he made no move toward it. As he reached for a piece of bread, his cousin Bimbo smirked and leaned in toward Femi. "So, Femi, did you hear what happened to one of my friend's uncles? He lost his business and came crawling back to his family, begging for help," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Femi chuckled, his eyes darting briefly toward Aid. "Ah, that's the way of the world. Some people make bad decisions and expect others to clean up after them." The entire table laughed. Aid clenched his jaw but said nothing. Suddenly, Mama Omoteo walked in, her grand presence silencing the room. She was dressed in an elegant iro and buba, her jewel perched high on her head like a crown. She glanced at Aid with a tight smile. "Ah, Aid, you're awake," she said, her tone neutral. "I hope the room you were given was comfortable." "It was fine, Mama," Aid replied softly, watching her carefully. Mama Omoteo sat at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the room as though she were appraising everyone. "Femi, have you informed the staff to prepare Aid a proper place to stay?" Femi blinked. "Mama, he said he's fine where he is. Besides, we don't have much space right now. You know how busy things have been with all the renovations." Mama Omoteo raised an eyebrow. "Busy? The East Wing is practically empty." Femi laughed nervously, avoiding her gaze. Aid said nothing, but he made a mental note of how quickly his brother tried to dismiss him. Unwelcome advice. Later that day, Aid sat in the garden, watching the workers tending to the flowers. It was peaceful, but his thoughts were anything but calm. He didn't have long to himself before Bimbo and another cousin, Sola, strolled over to him, drinks in hand. "Aid," Bimbo began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was just telling Sola how inspiring your story is." "Inspiring?" Aid asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. You know, how you went abroad, faced such challenges, and now you're back. It shows resilience," Bimbo said, her smile never reaching her eyes. Sola chuckled. But let's be honest, Aid. Did you maybe make some bad investments? Or trust the wrong people? I mean, these things don't just happen for no reason. Aid stared at them, his face expressionless. He could feel the underlying judgment in their words. These were the same people who had begged him for money in the past, money for weddings, business ventures, and even vacations. Now, they were looking at him as though he were a cautionary tale. Life has its ups and downs, Aid said simply, leaning back in his chair. The important thing is how we handle them. Bimbo smirked. True. But sometimes, you just have to accept when you've fallen and move on. Aid didn't respond. He had heard enough. That evening, Mama Omoteo summoned Aid to her private sitting room. The room was richly decorated with imported furniture, expensive artwork, and a faint scent of lavender. Aid, sit, she said, motioning to the chair across from her. He obeyed, folding his hands in his lap like a schoolboy about to be scolded. Aid, you've always been my pride, she began, her voice softer than it had been at breakfast. When your father passed, I was worried about how you'd handle the family's name. But you surpassed all my expectations. Thank you, Mama, Aid said quietly. She sighed deeply. But now, this situation you're in, her eyes bore into his. Are you sure there's nothing you're hiding from me? No secret you've buried? Aid hesitated. Mama Omoteo's intuition had always been sharp. He could see the concern in her eyes, mixed with something else, disappointment. Or fear of what this supposed failure might do to the family's reputation. No, Mama, he lied. I've told you everything. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Fine. But, Aid, remember this family is only as strong as its weakest link. Don't let your misfortune drag us all down. Her words stung, but Aid kept his face neutral. I understand, Mama, he said, rising to his feet. As he left the room, he clenched his fists. The test was far from over, but he was beginning to see the truth. Some bonds were only as strong as the wealth that held them together. A sudden twist. 2 nights later, as Aid prepared to head to bed, he overheard a hushed conversation outside his room. You're sure about this? It was Feemy's voice, low and conspiratorial. Yes, came Bimbo's reply. If we can convince Mama, we'll get him to sell the shares in the family company. He's desperate now. He'll do anything. Aid's heart raced. So this was their plan, to strip him of the family company his father had built, the company that had been the foundation of his wealth. He leaned closer to the door, his anger rising. He had suspected greed, but this betrayal went deeper than he thought. Aid sat frozen in the darkness of his room, his heart pounding as he processed what he had overheard. His brother Feemy and cousin Bimbo, 2 of the people he had supported the most in their times of need, were plotting to rob him of the family company. The betrayal was deeper than he could have imagined, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let them succeed. He cracked the door open slightly, peering into the dimly lit hallway. Feemy and Bimbo stood at the far end, their voices low but their urgency palpable. You know how Mama is, Feemy whispered. She'll never approve unless we frame it the right way. We'll tell her that the company's finances are at risk because of Aid's situation. She's too proud to let the family name be associated with failure. Once she's on our side, it's game over for him. Bimbo nodded eagerly. Exactly. And we'll spin it as if we're doing it for the family's good. Mama will believe us, she always listens to you. Aid felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. Bursting out and confronting them now would accomplish nothing. He needed a plan. If Feemy and Bimbo were willing to manipulate Mama, he would have to act strategically to expose them. The next morning, Aid made a point to act as though everything was normal. He greeted his siblings warmly, thanked Mama Omoteo for breakfast, and even laughed at Feemy's over-the-top jokes. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind was working overtime. He needed allies, people in the household who could help him uncover the full extent of Feemy and Bimbo's scheme. His first thought was to speak to Remy. While her initial reaction to his return had been cautious, she had always been the most level-headed of his siblings. That afternoon, Aid found Remy in the garden, tending to the flowers. She looked up as he approached, wiping her hands on a cloth. Aid, she said, her tone curious. "What brings you out here?" "I wanted to talk," he said, sitting down on a nearby bench. "About everything." She raised an eyebrow. "Everything?" He nodded. "Remy, I need to know the truth. How do you really feel about me being back? And, what's going on with Femi and the others?" Remy hesitated, her eyes darting around as though she were afraid someone might overhear. "Aid, you know how this family is. People pretend to care, but most of them are only loyal to their own interests. Femi has been running the company as if it's his personal bank account since you left. And Bimbo, well, she's always been an opportunist." Aid leaned forward. "Do you trust me?" She blinked in surprise. "What kind of question is that?" "An important one," he said firmly. "Because I need your help, Remy. Femi and Bimbo are plotting something against me. I overheard them last night. They want to take the company from me, and they're planning to manipulate Mama to do it." Remy's eyes widened. "What? Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Aid replied. "I need you to keep your ears open. Listen to what they're saying when I'm not around. If we can gather proof of their intentions, we can stop them." Remy stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll help you. But, Aid, will be careful. Femi is more cunning than you think." "I know," Aid said quietly. "But so am I." Over the next few days, Aid began to plant seeds of doubt and curiosity among the family. He casually mentioned his supposed plans to sell off his shares in the company to pay off his debts, knowing the news would spread like wildfire. At dinner one evening, he made a show of sighing heavily and saying, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time to let go of the company. It's not like I can manage it in my current state anyway." The reaction was immediate. Femi's fork clattered onto his plate, and Bimbo nearly choked on her drink. Even Mama Omoteo looked up sharply. "What are you saying, Aid?" Mama asked, her tone laced with concern. "I'm just thinking aloud, Mama," Aid said, shrugging. "Maybe it's for the best. Femi has been handling things well in my absence, hasn't he? Maybe he should take full control." Femi tried to hide his smirk but failed miserably. "Well, you know, I've been doing my best to keep things afloat," he said, feigning modesty. Bimbo chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet. "Aid, you're so generous to even consider that. It just shows how much you care about the family." Aid forced a smile, watching their reactions carefully. They were taking the bait. 2 nights later, Remy came to Aid's room, her expression tense. "I found something," she whispered, handing him a folded piece of paper. Aid unfolded it and scanned the document. It was a draft letter addressed to the company's board of directors, proposing a transfer of Aid's shares to Femi in the interest of stabilizing the family business. "Where did you get this?" Aid asked, his voice low. "Bimbo left it in the study," Remy said. "I don't think she expected anyone to see it." Aid's jaw tightened. This was exactly the proof he needed. "Thank you, Remy," he said. "I'll take it from here." The next evening, Aid called for a family meeting in the grand living room. Everyone gathered, curious but wary. Femi and Bimbo exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure of what was happening. Once everyone was seated, Aid stood at the center of the room, holding the draft letter in his hand. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since I got back," he began, his voice steady. "And I realized something. This family isn't what I thought it was." Mama Omoteo frowned. "What do you mean, Aid?" "I mean that not everyone here has the family's best interests at heart," Aid said, his eyes locking onto Femi and Bimbo. "Some people are more interested in lining their own pockets." Femi shifted uncomfortably. "Aid, what are you talking about?" Aid held up the letter. "I'm talking about this." "Care to explain, Femi?" "Bimbo?" Bimbo's face went pale, and Femi stammered, "Where did you get that?" "That's not the point," Aid said, his voice rising. "The point is that you were plotting behind my back to steal the company that Baba built with his blood, sweat, and tears. And you were going to manipulate Mama to do it." Mama Omoteo gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Is this true?" she demanded, glaring at Femi. Femi opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Aid took a step closer. I may look like a failure to you right now, but I haven't lost everything. And I won't let you destroy this family's legacy out of greed. The room fell into tense silence, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavily in the air. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the faint sound of the ceiling fan whirring overhead. Femi's face was a mixture of anger and fear, while Bimbo clutched the edge of her seat, visibly panicked. Mama Omoteo, who rarely allowed her emotions to slip, looked deeply hurt and furious all at once. Femi, Mama Omoteo's voice was ice-cold, cutting through the tension like a blade. Is this true? Were you really plotting to steal from your brother? Mama, it's not what it looks like, Femi stammered, his voice shaky. He shot a desperate glance at Bimbo, but she was too busy looking down at her feet to offer him any support. Not what it looks like, Aid said sharply, his calm demeanor finally cracking. Then what is it, Femi? Because this letter makes it very clear what you and Bimbo were planning. Bimbo finally spoke, her voice trembling. Mama, we didn't mean to. It's just that Aid hasn't been around, and the company needed stability. We thought. You thought what? Mama snapped, cutting her off. That you could manipulate me. That you could undermine your own brother while pretending to care about this family. Femi's face hardened. He was cornered, and he knew it. Mama, listen. Aid abandoned this family years ago. He went abroad, made his money, and forgot about us. He left me to handle everything. I've been the one holding this family together while he's been living his life in luxury. And now he comes back, claiming to have lost everything, and we're supposed to just hand everything over to him again. Aid's fists clenched at his sides. You've been holding the family together by spending recklessly and running the company into the ground. Don't make me laugh, Femi. I've seen the financial reports. You've siphoned more money out of that company for your own indulgences than you've put into it. You're not protecting the family, you're protecting yourself. Mema Omoteo shook her head, her voice trembling with anger. I cannot believe this. My own children, scheming against each other like this. Your father would be ashamed. Mema, I was only trying to do what's best for the family, Femi said weakly, but the conviction in his voice was gone. No, you were trying to do what's best for you, Aid said. He turned to the rest of the family, who had been watching the drama unfold in stunned silence. This is what happens when people value money over loyalty, greed over love. I came back to see if this family still cared about me for who I am, not for what I can give them. And now I have my answer. A mother's command. Mema Omoteo stood up slowly, her regal presence commanding the room. Enough, she said, her voice firm and final. This ends now. Femi and Bimbo looked up at her, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. Femi, Bimbo, you have disgraced this family with your selfishness and deceit. I entrusted you with the family's affairs, and you betrayed that trust. From this moment on, you are both removed from any decision-making roles in the company. What? Mema, you can't, Femi began, but Mema Omoteo silenced him with a glare. I can, and I will, she said. Aid will oversee the company's affairs from now on. And until I am convinced that you have both learned the value of family and loyalty, you will not have access to a single kobo of the company's profits. Bimbo gasped. Mama, please, that's too harsh. It's what you deserve, Mama said coldly. You should be grateful I'm not disowning you entirely. Femi's face turned red with rage. This is ridiculous. Aid comes back after years of ignoring us, and he's the hero. No, I won't accept this. You don't have to accept it, Mama said sharply. It's not up for debate. And if you continue to challenge my authority, you will find yourself cut off completely. Do I make myself clear? Femi fell silent, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. Aid's decision. After the meeting, Aid found himself alone on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. The confrontation had left him drained, but he knew it wasn't over. Femi and Bimbo might have been put in their place for now, but their resentment would only grow. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Mama Omoteo approaching. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softer now. You've been through a lot, Aid, she said quietly. And I know this wasn't the homecoming you hoped for. No, It wasn't, Aid admitted. But maybe it's what I needed to see. The truth about this family. Mama nodded. Your father always said that money has a way of revealing people's true nature. I didn't want to believe that my own children could be so blinded by greed. Aid sighed. I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were, Mama. Too much has been said, too much has been done. But you're still here, Mama said. That means there's hope. Aid looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Maybe. But I need time to figure out what comes next. Mama nodded, squeezing his shoulder before walking away, leaving Aid alone with his thoughts once more. The next morning, an unexpected visitor. As Aid prepared to leave the house for a meeting with the company's board, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find Remy standing there, her face pale and worried. Aid, she said quickly. I think you need to see this. She handed him a folder filled with documents. As Aid flipped through the pages, his stomach dropped. It was a series of unauthorized withdrawals from the company's accounts, withdrawals that had been made under Femi's name. But that wasn't the shocking part. The final few transactions were recent, dated after the family meeting where Femi had been stripped of his authority. How is this possible? Aid asked, his voice low but furious. I don't know, Remy said. But it means Femi is still up to something. And it looks like he's not giving up without a fight. Aid's grip tightened on the folder. He had hoped the family drama was behind him, but it was clear that the storm was far from over. Aid paced the length of his room, the folder of incriminating documents clutched tightly in his hand. His mind raced with possibilities. If Femi was still accessing the company's funds despite being removed from any position of authority, it meant he had accomplices. Someone on the inside was helping him, and that someone needed to be uncovered. Remy sat on the edge of his bed, watching her brother with concern. Aid, what are you going to do? Femi isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants. You know how he is. Aid paused and looked at her, his expression serious. This isn't just about Femi anymore, Remy. He's clearly working with someone at the company. I need to figure out who it is, and fast. What's your plan? I'll start by confronting Femi, Aid said. If I push him hard enough, he might slip up and reveal something. But I need you to stay close to Mama. If he tries to manipulate her again, I need to know immediately. Remy nodded. I'll do my best. But, Aid, or be careful. Femi's pride has been wounded, and when someone like him feels cornered, they can get dangerous. Aid gave her a small, reassuring smile. Don't worry about me. Femi's playing games, but he doesn't realize who he's up against. The confrontation. That evening, Aid found Femi in the family's private lounge, sipping on an expensive glass of brandy as though he didn't have a care in the world. Enjoying yourself? Aid said as he entered the room, his voice cool and even. Femi looked up, his expression unreadable. Ah, the prodigal son. To what do I owe the pleasure? Aid dropped the folder onto the coffee table in front of him. Care to explain this? Femi's eyes flicked to the folder, and for a brief moment, Aid saw a flash of panic cross his face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a smug grin. What's this? More accusations? Femi asked, leaning back in his chair. Unauthorized withdrawals, Aid said, his tone sharp. Made after Mama stripped you of your authority in the company. So tell me, Femi, how exactly did you pull this off? Femi swirled his brandy, his grin widening. You think you're so smart, don't you? Coming back here with your little test to see who loves you for who you are. But the truth is, Aid, you're just like the rest of us. You hide behind your self-righteousness, but deep down, you're as hungry for control as anyone else in this family. Don't change the subject, Aid said, taking a step closer. Who's helping you? Femi's grin faltered. You don't have any proof that I did anything wrong. Aid smirked, pulling out his phone. Actually, I do. He pressed play on a recording. It was a conversation between Femi and an unidentified voice, discussing how to bypass certain company protocols to access funds. Femi's face turned pale. You recorded me? I've been recording everything since I got back, Aid said, his voice like steel. I knew you'd slip up eventually. Now, you have two choices. Confess and tell me who's helping you, or I take this to Mama and the board. Femi's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, Aid thought his brother might actually lash out. But then Femi let out a bitter laugh and leaned forward. You think you've won, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Fine. I'll tell you what you want to know. But you're not going to like it. According to Femi, the person helping him was none other than Chief Augundal, a senior member of the company's board of directors. Chief Augundal had been a close friend of their father's, but in recent years, he had grown greedy and resentful of Aid's dominance in the business. When Femi approached him with promises of shared power, Augundal had readily agreed to assist in siphoning funds and creating a plan to oust Aid permanently. He's been in on this from the beginning, Femi said, a smug look returning to his face. You were so busy playing the big, successful brother that you didn't even notice the cracks forming under your feet. Aid's stomach turned at the revelation. Chief Augundal had been like an uncle to him growing up. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected. You're pathetic, Aid said, shaking his head. You let your greed and jealousy ruin everything Baba worked for. Femi shrugged. Call it what you want. But you can't run this company alone, Aid. Not without allies. And right now, your allies are few and far between. Aid turned to leave, but Femi's voice stopped him. Oh, and one more thing, Femi said. You might want to keep an eye on Mama. She's not as strong as she used to be. All this stress, it's not good for her. Aid froze, his anger flaring. He turned back to Femi, his eyes blazing. If anything happens to Mama because of you, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. Femi raised his glass in mock salute. Good luck, brother. The next day, Aid arranged a private meeting with Chief Augundal at a quiet restaurant in the city. He didn't let on that he already knew about the man's involvement with Femi. Instead, he presented himself as a man seeking advice and guidance in the wake of the family drama. Chief, you've been a pillar of support for this family for years, Aid said, his tone respectful but measured. I need your help now more than ever. Augundal leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. You've been through a lot, Aid. But running a company like this requires more than just ambition. It requires trust. And I trust you, Aid said, forcing a smile. That's why I want you to take a more active role in helping me stabilize things. Together, we can ensure the company's future. Augundal's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. Very well. Let's discuss what needs to be done. As they spoke, Aid carefully steered the conversation toward the recent financial discrepancies. He watched Augundal closely, noting the subtle shifts in his expression whenever the unauthorized withdrawals were mentioned. By the end of the meeting, Aid was certain of one thing: Augundal was nervous. And nervous men made mistakes. Back at the office, Aid began putting his plan into motion. He quietly informed the company's head of security to monitor all transactions and communications involving Chief Augundal. He also began gathering more evidence of Femi's and Augundal's activities, enlisting the help of a trusted accountant who had been with the company since his father's time. Days later, Aid received the confirmation he had been waiting for. Augundal was caught red-handed authorizing another unauthorized withdrawal. The stage was set. For more creative writing help and, with the evidence in hand, Aid knew it was time to act. He called for an emergency meeting at the company's headquarters, inviting the board of directors, including Chief Augundal, to attend. The setting was perfect: a grand conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling city, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. Femi, clearly rattled by the sudden meeting, sat at one end of the table, trying to project confidence. Chief Augundal was his usual composed self, but Aid noticed the subtle way he avoided eye contact. The rest of the board members murmured amongst themselves, unaware of the bombshell that was about to drop. As Aid entered the room, all eyes turned to him. He placed a thick folder on the table, its contents meticulously organized: transaction records, audio recordings, and emails that tied both Femi and Augundal to the embezzlement scheme. Thank you all for coming, Aid began, his voice calm but commanding. Today, we address a matter that threatens the integrity of this company and the legacy my father built. The murmurs stopped. Augundal shifted in his seat. 4 months, unauthorized withdrawals have been made from the company's accounts, Aid continued, opening the folder and spreading the documents across the table. These transactions were carefully hidden, but we've traced them back to 2 individuals in this room. The tension in the room was palpable. Chief Augundal, Aid said, locking eyes with the older man. As a senior member of this board, you were trusted to uphold the values of this company. Instead, you've betrayed that trust by working with Femi to siphon funds for your personal gain. A gasp rippled through the room. This is outrageous. Augundal barked, rising to his feet. You can't make such baseless accusations without proof. Proof? Aid said with a cold smile. I'm glad you mentioned that. He pressed a button on the remote in his hand, and a projector screen lit up behind him. First came the transaction records showing withdrawals linked to Augundal's authorization codes. Then came the audio recordings of his conversations with Femi, discussing their plans to undermine Aid. The final blow was an email exchange, projected in bold letters for all to see, where Augundal promised Femi a hefty payout in exchange for his cooperation. Augundal's face turned ashen. Femi, who had been silently watching the spectacle, suddenly stood up. This is a setup, Femi shouted, pointing at Aid. You're just trying to make me look bad. Aid turned to him, his voice sharp. You don't need my help to look bad, Femi. You've done that all on your own. The board's verdict. By the time Aid finished presenting his case, the room was in chaos. The board members were furious, demanding answers from Augundal and Femi. We trusted you, one of the directors exclaimed, glaring at Augundal. How could you do this to the company? This isn't over, Augundal hissed, his composure cracking. You'll regret this, Aid. No, Chief, Aid said, his voice firm. You're the one who'll regret it. Effective immediately, you are removed from this board, and legal action will be taken against you for your crimes. Security is waiting outside to escort you off the premises. 2 uniformed security guards entered the room, and Augundal's protests were drowned out as they led him away. Aid turned to the board. As for Femi, I'll leave it to the board to decide his fate. But let me be clear, this company will no longer tolerate corruption, no matter who it comes from. The board members nodded in agreement, their respect for Aid clearly growing. Femi, realizing his position was untenable, slumped back into his chair, defeated. For once, he had nothing to say. Later that evening, Aid returned to the family home, exhausted but triumphant. As he entered the living room, he found Mema Omoteo waiting for him, her expression unreadable. You handled yourself well today, she said after a long silence. Your father would have been proud. Aid sighed, sitting down across from her. I didn't want it to come to this, Mama. But Femi left me no choice. Mama nodded slowly. I know. I raised all of you to be strong, but somewhere along the way, Femi and Bimbo lost sight of what's important. I only hope this will teach them a lesson. Do you really think they'll change? Aid asked, his tone skeptical. I don't know, Mama admitted. But one thing is certain, you've proven that you're capable of leading this family and this company. And for that, I'm grateful. Aid looked at her, the weight of the day's events finally settling on him. I just want us to be a family again, Mama. Money has torn us apart for too long. Mama reached out and took his hand. Then maybe it's time to rebuild. But it will take time, Aid. And forgiveness. Aid nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready to forgive just yet. A shadow lurking. That night, as Aid lay in bed, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Watch your back. Aid stared at the message, his jaw tightening. He knew it could only be from one person, Femi. The storm might have passed for now, but Aid realized the battle for his family's legacy was far from over. The message from the unknown number kept replaying in Aid's mind. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning that Femi wasn't done, even after being publicly exposed. Aid knew his brother's pride and greed wouldn't let him go down without a fight. But what could Femi possibly do next? With Augundal disgraced and out of the picture, Aid thought he had neutralized the biggest threats to his control over the company. Still, Something about the message unsettled him. Femi wasn't clever enough to pull off a grand scheme alone. If he had sent this threat, then there were likely others lurking in the shadows, waiting to make their move. The next morning, Aid made his way to the office earlier than usual. He'd instructed the company's head of security, Mr. Aluko, to prepare a full security sweep of their systems. Something told him that this fight wasn't going to stay confined to boardrooms and family drama. By mid-afternoon, Mr. Aluko called Aid into the company's cybersecurity unit. His face was grim as he handed Aid a report. "What is this?" Aid asked, scanning the document. "Sir," Aluko said, folding his hands in front of him, "it appears that someone attempted to gain unauthorized access to the company's internal systems late last night. Specifically, the accounting database and payroll systems." Aid frowned. "Did they succeed?" "No," Aluko said. "Our firewalls caught the attempt and locked them out. But what's troubling is that the attack came from an IP address associated with one of the company's own servers." Aid's stomach dropped. "Are you saying the breach came from inside the company?" Aluko nodded grimly. "Yes, sir. We're still investigating, but it's clear that someone within the organization is still working against you." Aid's thoughts immediately turned to Femi. Could he have an accomplice still embedded within the company? Or was this the work of someone else entirely? Either way, it was clear that the threat wasn't over. "Keep digging," Aid said. "And tighten security across all departments. I don't want so much as a printer being accessed without clearance." "Yes, sir," Aluko replied. Mama's plea. That evening, Aid returned home, exhausted and burdened by the weight of the new discovery. He found Mema Omoteo waiting for him in the living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You look troubled, my son," she said as he sat down. "It's nothing, Mema," Aid replied, though his tone betrayed him. Mema Omoteo studied him closely. "Is it about Femi?" Aid sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Femi isn't going to stop, Mama. Even after everything, he's still trying to undermine me. And now he's dragged the company into his mess again." Mama's face fell, and for a moment, she looked older, more fragile. "Aid, I know Femi has done terrible things, but he's still your brother. There has to be a way to reach him." Aid shook his head. "He doesn't want to be reached, Mama. He's too blinded by his own greed to see reason. He doesn't care about this family, he only cares about himself." Mama's voice softened. "But do you care about him, Aid? Beneath all the anger and betrayal, do you still love your brother?" Aid looked away, unsure of how to answer. Did he love Femi? The bond they'd once shared as children felt like a distant memory, buried under years of resentment and competition. But deep down, a part of him still yearned for the family they used to be. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I do. But that doesn't mean I can let him destroy everything Baba built." Mama nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Just remember, Aid, forgiveness doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, it's the only way to heal." The next morning, as Aid was preparing to leave for the office, Remy came rushing into the house, her face pale and panicked. "Aid," she called, her voice trembling. Aid turned to her, immediately on edge. "What's wrong?" "It's Femi," she said, her eyes wide. "He's gone." "Gone?" Aid repeated, frowning. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean he's left," Remy said. "His room is empty, and one of the drivers said he saw him leaving the estate late last night with 2 large suitcases." Aid's mind raced. Why would Femi leave now, especially after sending that cryptic message? Was he running away? Or was this part of some larger plan? Did he say anything to anyone before he left? Aid asked. Remy shook her head. "No." But, she hesitated, then pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "He left this for you." Aid unfolded the note and read the hastily scrawled message. "You've won for now, but this isn't the end. I'll be back, and when I am, everything you've taken from me will be mine." Aid's jaw tightened. Femi might be gone, but his words carried a chilling promise. The bigger threat. Later that day, Aid's fears were confirmed. Mr. Aluko called him back to the office with an urgent update. "Sir," Aluko said, his voice grave, We've traced the source of the attempted breach from last night. It appears that Femi downloaded sensitive company data before he left. What kind of data? Aide asked, his chest tightening. Financial records, client information, and even pending contracts, Aluko replied. If that information gets into the wrong hands, it could do serious damage to the company. Aide's mind raced. This wasn't just a petty act of revenge, this was a full-blown threat to the company's survival. If Femi had taken that data, he could sell it to competitors, leak it to the public, or use it as leverage to force his way back into the family business. Do we know where he went? Aide asked. Not yet, Aluko said. But we've alerted the authorities and are tracking his movements. We'll find him. Aide nodded, his jaw set. Good. And when you do, let me know immediately. Back at the family estate, the tension was palpable. Mema Omoteo was distraught, blaming herself for Femi's actions, while Remy tried to comfort her. Meanwhile, Bimbo, who had been unusually quiet since the board meeting, seemed torn between guilt and fear. As Aide sat in his father's old study that evening, staring at the portrait of Baba Omoteo on the wall, he felt a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. This isn't over, Baba, he muttered under his breath. But I promise you, I'll protect what you built. No matter what it takes. The days following Femi's disappearance were tense and chaotic. Aide's security team worked tirelessly to track his movements, but Femi had covered his tracks well. The stolen company data loomed over Aide like a dark cloud, threatening to destabilize everything. He couldn't shake the thought of what Femi might do with the information. At the family estate, the atmosphere was no better. Mema Omoteo was withdrawing into herself, her usual commanding presence dimmed by worry and heartbreak. Remy stayed close to her, doing her best to keep her calm, while Bimbo kept mostly to herself, her guilt clearly eating away at her. One morning, Aide received a call from Mr. Aluko. Sir, Aluko said urgently, we've located Femi. He's staying at a private villa outside Eco Royal, but there's more, you're going to want to hear this in person. A dangerous revelation. When Aide arrived at the office, Aluko was waiting for him in the security control room. He handed Aide a set of photographs taken from a surveillance team tailing Femi. The photos showed Femi meeting with a group of men in suits. One of the men was immediately recognizable, Chief Augundel. I should have known, Aide muttered, his grip tightening on the photos. Augundel isn't going to let this go. But the situation was worse than Aide initially thought. Aluko pulled up an audio recording from a wiretap placed near the villa. As the conversation played, Aide's worst fears were confirmed. Femi and Augundel were negotiating a deal to sell the stolen company data to one of their competitors, an international conglomerate known for aggressive acquisitions and shady dealings. The competitor, Zenith Global, had been circling Aide's company for years, looking for any opportunity to gain leverage. They're planning to use the data to launch a hostile takeover, Aluko said grimly. If this deal goes through, the company could lose everything: its clients, its contracts, even its reputation. Aide's blood ran cold. Femi wasn't just trying to hurt him, he was trying to destroy the family legacy entirely. Do we know when this deal is supposed to happen? Aide asked. Yes, Aluko replied. In 2 days, at a private event being hosted by Zenith Global in their Lagos office. Aide nodded, his mind racing. We need to stop this. Whatever it takes. Aide knew he couldn't handle this alone. He needed allies, people he could trust to help him outmaneuver Femi and Augundel. His first stop was Remy, who was in the garden tending to Mama's plants. Remy, Aide said, his tone serious, I need your help. She looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. What is it? Aide quickly explained the situation, laying out Femi's plan and the danger it posed to the family and the company. Remy's eyes widened in shock. Femi is trying to sell the company to Zenith Global? That's madness. It is, Aide agreed. But he's desperate. He knows this is his last chance to take everything from us. I can't let that happen. What do you need me to do? Remy asked, her voice resolute. I need you to keep an eye on Mama, Aide said. She doesn't need to know all the details right now, this would only stress her more. But if Femi tries to contact her or manipulate her in any way, let me know immediately. Remy nodded. You can count on me. But, Aid, or be careful. Femi is dangerous when he feels cornered. I will, Aid promised. Next, Aid sought out Bimbo, who was sitting in the lounge, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he entered, her face wary. Bimbo, Aid said, sitting across from her, we need to talk. What now? She asked, her tone defensive. I know you've been keeping your distance since the board meeting, Aid said. But right now, I need to know if you're with me or against me. Bimbo frowned. What are you talking about? Femi is trying to sell the company to Zenith Global, Aid said bluntly. And if he succeeds, everything Barbara worked for will be gone. I need to know if you're going to help me stop him or if you're going to sit back and let him destroy our family. Bimbo's face paled, and for a moment, she was silent. Then she sighed heavily. I didn't know it had gotten this bad, she admitted. I've been angry at you, Aid, but I never wanted things to go this far. So, will you help me? Aid asked, his gaze steady. Bimbo hesitated, then nodded. Yes. But only because I don't want to see this family fall apart any more than it already has. Good, Aid said. Then we're going to need a plan. 2 days later, Aid and his team were ready. Using the evidence they had gathered, they contacted the authorities and arranged for a sting operation to intercept Femi and Augundal during their meeting with Zenith Global. Aid himself would be on site, ensuring that everything went according to plan. The meeting was set to take place in a high-rise office building in Victoria Island, Lagos. Aid arrived early, dressed in a sharp suit, his confidence masking the tension he felt inside. As the time for the meeting approached, Femi, Augundal, and the Zenith Global representatives entered the conference room. Aid watched from a nearby surveillance van, his heart pounding as the scene unfolded on the monitors. They're making the deal, Aluko whispered, pointing to the live feed. This is it. At the signal from the authorities, the doors to the conference room burst open, and a team of law enforcement officers stormed in. Femi and Augundal froze, their faces filled with shock as they were handcuffed and escorted out of the building. Aid stepped out of the van, watching as Femi was led past him. You did this, Femi hissed, his eyes blazing with hatred. No, Aid said calmly. You did this to yourself. The fallout was swift. With Femi and Augundal exposed, the company's reputation was preserved, and the stolen data was safely recovered. Zenith Global, caught in the middle of the sting, quickly distanced itself from the scandal to avoid further scrutiny. At home, Mama Omoteo was heartbroken but relieved that the family's legacy had been saved. You did what you had to do, Aid, she said, holding his hand. But I pray that one day, Femi will see the error of his ways. Aid nodded, though he wasn't sure if that day would ever come. For now, he was focused on rebuilding the company and the family. The days following Femi's arrest were a whirlwind of consequences. The scandal made headlines across Nigeria's business world, with media outlets labeling the Omoteo family feud as a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. Chief Augundal, already disgraced, was formally charged with fraud and conspiracy. But it was Femi's involvement that caused the biggest stir. For Mama Omoteo, the ordeal was almost too much to bear. Despite everything, she insisted on visiting Femi in detention before his trial. Aid tried to talk her out of it, but she wouldn't be swayed. He's still my son, she said firmly. He's made mistakes, but he needs to know that I haven't given up on him. Reluctantly, Aid accompanied her to the detention center. When they were led into the small, dimly lit visitation room, Femi was already seated on the other side of the glass, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as they entered, his expression a mixture of defiance and shame. A mother's plea. Femi, Mama Omoteo said softly as she picked up the phone on her side of the glass. Femi hesitated before picking up his own receiver. Mama, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause before she spoke again. Why, Femi? Why would you do this to your family? To your father's legacy? Femi's jaw clenched. You always loved Aid more, he said bitterly. Everything was about him. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I was just there. That's not true, Mama said, her voice trembling. "I loved all my children equally. But love doesn't mean I can overlook your mistakes, Femi. Your father worked so hard to build this family's name, and you tried to tear it apart." Femi looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "You've hurt us, Femi," Mama continued, her tears beginning to fall. "But you're still my son, and I'll always pray for you. I hope that one day, you'll find it in your heart to change." Femi didn't respond. He simply placed the phone down and walked back to his cell, leaving Mama in tears. As they drove back to the family estate, Mama sat silently in the backseat, staring out the window. Aid glanced at her through the rearview mirror, guilt gnawing at him. Despite everything Femi had done, he couldn't shake the memory of the bond they'd shared as children. That night, Aid sat in his father's old study, surrounded by the books and artifacts that Baba Omoteo had cherished. He stared at a family portrait on the wall, himself, Femi, Remy, Bimbo, and their parents, all smiling together. It felt like a lifetime ago. Remy entered the study quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked, setting one mug in front of him. Aid nodded. "I keep asking myself if I could have done something differently. Maybe if I'd stayed closer to the family instead of leaving for so long, things wouldn't have turned out this way." Remy sat down across from him. "Don't do that to yourself, Aid. Femi made his choices. He let his jealousy and greed consume him. That's not your fault. I just wish," Aid trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't know. I wish things didn't have to end like this." Remy placed a hand on his. "There's still time for Femi to turn things around. Maybe not now, but one day. Until then, we have to focus on rebuilding." Aid nodded, her words giving him a small measure of comfort. Over the next few months, Aid threw himself into his work. The company, once shaken by the scandal, began to stabilize under his leadership. He implemented strict policies to prevent future corruption, earning the trust of the board and the employees. But his focus wasn't just on the business. At home, he made a conscious effort to mend the fractured relationships within the family. Remy became his closest confidant, offering advice and support as they worked together to restore the family's reputation. Bimbo, who had finally admitted her own mistakes, took on a more active role in the family's charitable foundation, determined to redeem herself. As for Mama Omoteo, she slowly regained her strength. She began hosting family dinners again, insisting that they come together as often as possible. Though the empty chair at the table served as a painful reminder of Femi's absence, she remained hopeful that one day, he would find his way back to them. It wasn't until a year later that Aid received an unexpected letter. The envelope was plain and unmarked, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Femi's. "Dear Aid, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for what I've done. Honestly, I'm not even sure I deserve forgiveness. But sitting in this cell has forced me to confront the man I've become, and I don't like what I see. I was wrong, Aid. About everything. I let my envy and bitterness destroy my relationships, and I nearly destroyed our family in the process. You were right to stop me. I don't expect you to trust me again, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. For Mama, for Baba, and for myself. Maybe one day, I'll earn a place in this family again. Femi." Aid read the letter twice, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and cautious hope. He wasn't sure if Femi's words were genuine, but a part of him wanted to believe that his brother was finally taking responsibility for his actions. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. Forgiveness would take time, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was still hope for redemption. The legacy lives on. Years later, the Omoteo family had become stronger than ever. The company thrived under Aid's leadership, expanding into new markets while maintaining the values that Baba Omoteo had instilled. At a family gathering, Mama Omoteo looked around the room, her eyes filled with pride. Remy was chatting with Bimbo about a new charity project, and Aid stood nearby, talking to a group of young entrepreneurs he was mentoring. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The family wasn't perfect, no family was. But they had weathered the storm, and their bond was stronger for it. And though Femi's absence still left a hole in her heart, she held on to hope that one day, they would all be together again. 2 years had passed since the scandal rocked the Omoteo family. The company had flourished under Ade's leadership, reclaiming its reputation and even surpassing its former success. The family estate, once a place of tension and fractures, had become a home of unity. Mama Omoteo's health had improved, and Bimbo had carved out her role as a leader in the family's charitable endeavors. Yet despite the progress, one shadow remained: Femi. He had served his time quietly, avoiding further scandals or antics. Rumors of his behavior in prison, keeping to himself, refusing to join any cliques, and focusing on self-improvement had reached the family through Remy, who occasionally visited him despite Ade's initial protests. But as Femi's release date drew closer, the tension in the family began to grow again. Would he return? Could he be trusted? And more importantly, did he truly regret his actions? It was a cloudy evening when Femi finally returned to the estate. The news of his release had been kept quiet, as Mama Omoteo had requested a private reunion. The family gathered in the sitting room, the air thick with anticipation. When the front door finally opened, Femi stepped inside, carrying only a small bag. He looked different, thinner, older, and more subdued. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mama Omoteo rose from her seat, her eyes brimming with tears. "Femi," she said softly. "Mema," Femi replied, his voice cracking as he stepped forward and knelt before her. "I'm sorry. For everything." Mama pulled him into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "You're home now," she whispered. "That's all that matters." Ade stood off to the side, watching the reunion with a mixture of relief and wariness. Remy smiled warmly, while Bimbo looked uncertain but didn't protest. When Femi finally stood, he turned to Ade. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Femi took a deep breath. "Ade," he began, his voice trembling, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to trust me. But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I let my jealousy and greed destroy our relationship, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right." Ade studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "We'll see, Femi. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. But if you're serious about making things right, you'll have your chance." Femi nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Femi's return to the family wasn't without its challenges. Ade kept a close eye on him, assigning him a minor role in one of the company's subsidiaries to test his commitment. At first, there were murmurs of disapproval from the board, but Ade made it clear that Femi would earn his place or lose it. To everyone's surprise, Femi worked tirelessly. He arrived early, stayed late, and avoided the lavish lifestyle he once flaunted. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his reputation, not just within the company but also within the family. One evening, as Ade was working late in his office, Femi knocked on the door. "Come in," Ade called, surprised to see his brother. Femi entered, holding a folder. "I wanted to show you this," he said, placing the folder on the desk. Ade opened it and found a detailed proposal for expanding the company's operations into renewable energy, a project that Baba Omoteo had once dreamed of pursuing but had never had the chance to implement. "I've been working on this in my spare time," Femi explained. "I know I have a lot to prove, but I thought this could be a way to honor Baba's legacy." Ade looked up at his brother, genuinely impressed. This is good, Femi. Really good." Femi smiled faintly. "I just want to make things right." For the first time in years, Ade felt a glimmer of hope for their relationship. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, the family began to heal. Mema Omoteo, ever the peacemaker, took great joy in seeing her children come together again. Family dinners became a regular occurrence, and though the wounds of the past weren't entirely forgotten, they no longer defined the family's dynamic. One evening, as the family sat around the table laughing and reminiscing, Mama Omoteo raised her glass. "To Baba," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "He would be so proud of all of you." "To Baba," the family echoed, their voices united. As Ade looked around the table, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought them to this moment, a family, broken but mended, stronger than ever. Femi's redemption. Though Femi's path to redemption was far from complete, he continued to make amends. The renewable energy project became a massive success, earning him praise from the board and even from aid. But more importantly, it brought the brothers closer together, reminding them of the bond they had shared as children. One day, as they stood together on the balcony of the family estate, looking out over the city, Femi turned to Aid. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Aid asked. "For not giving up on me," Femi replied. Aid smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for Baba. For Mama. And for this family." Femi nodded, understanding. "Even so, I'm grateful." The Omoteo legacy. Years later, the Omoteo name became synonymous with resilience and integrity. The company thrived, expanding into new industries and leaving a lasting impact on the community. The family's story, once marred by scandal, became an example of how even the deepest wounds could be healed with time, effort, and forgiveness. And though Femi's journey was far from perfect, he proved that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen the farthest. As Aid looked back on everything they had endured, he felt a deep sense of pride not just for the family's accomplishments, but for the strength they had found in each other. The Omoteo legacy lived on, stronger than ever.